Okay, those of you who are holding copies of our schedule are going to be confused because the next item on the schedule says William Mays, and the young lady that I'm about to introduce is not looking like a William, nor is she William Mays. But come on up, Alena. This is Alena Van Arendonk. She is the secretary of the Franklin Township Historical Society and a longtime board member. And since we could not get Mr. Mays here as originally planned, we are going to have her tell you about our original and working Victrola.
As a note, I was doing this 10 minutes ago, so this is going to be improvised. But that's all right, because I do actually know a fair amount about this. Now, we have a lot of really fascinating artifacts in our collection. Many of them have been donated to us over the years by people who have lived in the township and said, oh, this was my great-great-aunt's, whatever it was from her house. So a lot of the items in here have a lot of history. And one thing I have learned through doing our school field trips and our presentations to students and clubs and things is a lot of people aren't really familiar with the type of technology that existed in previous centuries. So I want to talk today about the Victrola in our collection, and I will give you a little working demo of it because it is still in working order. And this is a purely mechanical device. There's no electronics, there's no microphone, there's nothing that's picking up, there's no electricity. It's purely mechanical, driven by the crank on the side. It winds up. The phonograph was invented around 1877 by Thomas Edison, who made wax cylinders that could be used to record sound. The flat disc that we now know as records or LPs were invented sometime in the 1890s. And the way they were recorded is you would go into a recording studio, which had to be kept around 90 degrees Fahrenheit because the wax had to keep soft. So it was very difficult if you were a musician trying to play in 90 degrees. And you would play or sing or speak into a horn-shaped device that would focus the sound into a needle that would be rotating on a wax disc that was on a turntable. And the vibrations of the needle would actually make an impression of the sound form on that wax disc. They would then transfer, whoever was producing the record would transfer that wax disc onto an electroplated copper master, and then they would make a mold of it, and they would cast records out of, using shellac. The early records were shellac, using the mold. So it was a two-part mold, like a sandwich. They would fill it and then press the master mold over it and make an exact copy of the sound forms. So the production process was fairly complicated and was all done by hand. There weren't machines cranking these out. You actually had people pouring material and pressing the things down. And that's where the term to press a record comes from, because they were literally pressing the records at that time. And in the 1890s, all the way up until the 1940s, really, the standard RPM of a record was 78. So you had, nowadays we had 33, we have 45s, we have 78s. I say nowadays. 33s are really the only ones getting produced anymore, and they're really collector's items. But 78 was the standard RPM. And the records, I'm going to step away from the microphone a bit, so I will try to talk louder so I can actually open this up.
Suggestion.
Yeah.
For those who are of a generation that don't remember records, you might explain, if you didn't already when I was outside, what RPM means.
RPM is revolutions per minute. That is how many times the record makes a complete circuit on the turntable every minute.
It's okay, grandpa's already made you McDonald's.
They may not be the only ones who need to. So modern records, by modern I mean pretty much anything produced after the 1950s, were pressed on vinyl, which was a much more flexible material. Shellac records are actually quite fragile, and if you drop them, they will shatter. So you will often hear terms like, sounding like a broken record. That's because if you damage the surface of the record, it would stick, and the needle would get stuck, and it would repeat the same phrase over and over, or the same few seconds over and over. But you can also, if you watch old Warner Brothers cartoons, people will smash records and they'll break into a billion pieces. If you hit a vinyl record really hard, it doesn't do anything. It's vinyl, it's flexible. If you drop this, it will break. So shellac records were very fragile. They were very sensitive to handling, so not only holding the edges, because you don't want to get your fingerprint oil on the grooves. Is that going to pick me up?
I think so. Especially if I move it down here.
Pause for technical. There we go. All right, I will continue speaking loud in hopes that that is true. All right, so this is a 78 RPM record. It's a little bit smaller than the 33 1/3 LPs that you may have seen more recently, and they're larger than 45s, which are the little ones that usually only held one song per side. These also only hold one song per side, so the play time is only a little over 3 minutes. They're not long playing records. Now the way this works, it is a purely mechanical device. So there's a crank on this side that you would use to wind up, and there's a spring that offers resistance, so it's just like a music box or a wind-up toy or anything else. And then when you push the release, the spring causes the record to rotate. There's a tone arm here with a rotating part that has a needle on the end. The needles are made of steel. They are one-use only needles. You change the needle every time you play a record. The reason for that is the shellac contains very hard compounds like limestone powder and other things that will actually wear the tip off the needle, and if you play with the same needle several times, it will damage the surface of the record and change the sound that is pressed on the record. So this is actually a very fragile setup. You can't just throw a record on there and keep it playing for 4 days. And you get one song playing. So when you turn on the turntable, you then rotate the needle down and carefully place it into the dead space at the edge of the record where there's no sound recorded, and the grooves will channel it in to play the part where the sound is recorded. You play through the song one time, you take out the needle, throw it away, put a new needle in, and you can play another song. You can get up to about 2 plays before it really starts damaging the record, but you do have to be careful, especially if you're playing really valuable records, to take care of the surface of them. So I am going to play, this is Sioux City Sue by Kate Smith. The way this plays, I'm going to open this up so you can actually hear it. The vibrations caused by the needle running over the grooves in the record travel through this arm down into a magnification system where they are amplified through a horn-shaped system that then the sound comes out of this part. Now, some really high-end players at the time, and these phonograph is the technical, or is the general term. This one is a Victrola. There were also gramophones. That was another trademarked name. You'll hear them referred to generically as all of those things, but phonographs in general. The fancy ones had a volume control where you could turn a knob on the side and control your volume. This is what made volume knobs the common way to adjust volume as opposed to a slider or anything else. So culturally, we think of turning up the volume. That came from the fact that turning the volume turned a gear that caused a physical shutter to open or close over the horn where the sound came out. So the next time you turn up the volume on your car stereo, you're actually hearkening back to the age of gramophones where you mechanically opened and closed a crank to turn the volume up or down because the shutter would block the sound or open the sound up. And those are only on the fancier models. This one is not a super fancy model because it's a portable. This is actually portable. The other ones were floor units, so it doesn't have the volume control. But let's go ahead and play Sioux City Sue. You'll notice there's not a lot of bass. Now, when these came out, they were extremely high-tech because before the invention of wax cylinders and later flat discs, there was no way to record sound. So the idea that you could go into a store and purchase music to play at home without owning a piano or without owning another instrument was revolutionary. And there were a lot of concerns at the time, but actually, since I don't know if the microphone's picking me up or not, I'm going to turn that off so I can talk over it. There were a lot of concerns at the time by music aficionados that this would kill music playing because a lot of people at that time had a small piano in their home or had people who were trained to play instruments. And if you were more wealthier, you would have a music room in your house where people would go to play music. You would have parties and you'd invite singers in to perform music. And there was a lot of concern that having portable, purchasable music that didn't require people in person playing instruments would actually stop the practice of learning music. And that was basically what happened. So, up until the turn of the 20th century, a lot of people tried to have at least one person in their family who knew how to play or sing something so they could have music as a part of their lives. Nowadays, unless you're playing in the school band or unless your parents send you to take piano lessons or you have a musical family because somebody has a music background, you don't tend to have a lot of instruments in the home. You tend to have recordings. You don't tend to have a lot of live playing in the home. So on the one hand, this was a great invention because it really made music accessible and affordable to all classes and all people, no matter where they were. They could buy a record, in the 20th century, you could buy a jazz record even if nobody in your city played jazz. But it did sort of kill off the tradition of having somebody in your household who could play or sing music. But music has survived, and we still have high school bands and rock bands and all these other things that people can pursue. But that is an example of one great invention that was purely mechanical, predated electricity in homes, and still made things accessible on a wide scale to people. And this is normally sitting right back behind these photo boards. It's going back there as soon as I'm done talking about it, and you are welcome to come up and look at it and open and close the doors. Please do not touch the needle or the record itself, simply because they are very fragile and we don't want to damage any part of our collection. I did just change this needle to do this demo, so it is a new needle, so it's somewhat sharp. But does anybody have any questions on my totally improvised speech? Yes?
I'm sure it's really hard to buy replacement needles.
It's not, actually. I was talking about talking to someone at the Indiana History Center yesterday about this. He says, because they've got their current You Are There exhibit is about the Jeanette Record Studio, and they have a star gramophone and records that they play in that. And they have to change the needles every time, and they're doing that multiple times a day, multiple times an hour for weeks. And he says they just go on eBay and buy giant packets of them. So they're actually quite, there are replica ones. You can also buy vintage ones, although the quality on those, they can rust, because they're just steel. They're pure steel. So you don't want to get a rusty or a dull one, but you can buy replacement ones fairly simply. It's actually easier to get needles for these than it is to get needles for your 1980s record player that had the cartridges. So, yeah. I saw other hands. Yes?
What's the age of this?
This one what is the age of this one? I want to say this one is early 20th century, like 1900s, maybe 1910. It's not much later than that because they started changing shape. And if you look at the Victrola logo and everything inside, it is very Victorian looking. So it might even be 1890s. I don't know if we have any documentation on it back there.
We have some people coming in that didn't get to hear Victrola that would like to, so if you can talk for an extra 30 seconds. while I
Okay,
do
let me answer the other questions, then I'll play it again. Okay.
Come on in.
Other questions? Yes.
How common was it to have that something that like everyone has, or did you have to be more wealthy to get one?
At first, like with any new technology, they were expensive when they came out, and then they became cheaper and more readily available. By the 1920s, 1930s, most people had them, unless you were very, very tight on money. They were affordable by that time, so most households would have had one. Or if you didn't have one, you knew somebody who had one. And records themselves were fairly affordable as well, so you could have a decent music collection. And there were different grades as well. I mean, you could have a really fancy floor model with all the bells and whistles, or you could have a very simple portable model. And you didn't need electricity, like the radios we have back there. We have a big 1920s radio that has the big round thing on top. You can identify it. Those ran on batteries because if you didn't have electricity in your home, you had to charge them up. And as I'll talk about later in my interurban talk, a lot of people only had electricity during the daytime. They didn't have it at night because the power company would turn off at night. So because these were mechanical, or they were at least available in mechanical form, you didn't have to have a house that was wired. You didn't have to have other things to use this. So they were pretty affordable by the 20s, I would say. In the 1870s and 80s, they were still pretty rare and very few people had them. Yes?
My late grandmother had a music box that had metal perforated discs in it. That also followed very much the format of the Victrola. Did that precede these, or was it a complement to them?
I don't know when those came into practice, but they follow the exact same mechanism as a player piano, and those, I believe, did predate these because, as you said, it was a perforated disc. Basically, they would punch up tabs, and the tabs would hit things as they rotated and cause vibrations. So the music boxes and the clockwork devices like that do go back pretty far. I mean, clockwork has been around for centuries and centuries. So those, I don't know exactly when those were invented or became commonplace, but I think they were earlier than this. The big revolution in this was you could press exact recordings onto the wax so you could get a human voice, which is something that a perforated disc can't reproduce.
So, comment, you mentioned Indiana Historical Society. Folks, if you haven't been up there, that's a great display they got that you were just alluding to.
Yep.
And they explained that, talk about many singers we didn't know came from Indiana. That's part of that narrative they do.
Indiana has a really rich musical history, yeah.
I'm going to, I'm sorry. I was going to say, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and do your additional demo of it, because for the people that came in late, and then as much as I hate to do it, I'm going to actually keep us on track, because Mr. Crapo is going to talk to us about the cemetery, and then Diane Hawk is going to offer those who are interested a tour of the cemetery directly across the street. So.
All right, so we'll
that.
do another short demo here.
This is our original Victrola.
And this will be back there to look at, and I believe we'll be able to answer questions too. That up. And I believe this record dates from the early 1940s. It is a later 78. It's not the same age as the Victrola, but you have to take what's available and what's still playing. And this one at least doesn't have physical damage or scratches on it, so it does play nicely, unlike some of the earlier ones that have worn out over the years. So thank you. I will have this moved back there, and then we will proceed with Danny's presentation.
Probably one of the more, I'm going to just move this.
Yeah, swing it back.
One of the more telling things that's been said to me in the last 10 minutes was David Brenton, who may or may not still be inside, came up, heard Alena talking at the front of the room and said, "She's just like her mother, her voice projects." So I want to hold up one of these Franklin Township Historical Society brochures. If you manage to get in here, thank you. If you manage to get in here without receiving one of these, please don't leave without one. This tells not only what we do to promote area history to the schools, the students, for people doing genealogical research, for all kinds of things, and we are preserving, at this point, 200 years of township history. Yes, my original great-great-great-grandfather came here in the 1820s. And so we want you to be able to be part of this. Please take a brochure, they're free, and find out, more about us.